You might be wondering why there are spider webs everywhere. And it actually does have to do with this week. It's not that someone has forgotten to clean, I promise. We've been preaching through the book of Genesis the past few weeks. This last Sunday, we began a mini-series focusing on Abraham's journey. Our emphasis for his story has been faith for the future. We were first introduced to Abram and Sarai, who are later called Abraham and Sarah, and just like last week, I'll be talking about them as Abraham and Sarah, except when the verses say otherwise. God had called them away from everything they knew, and Abraham obeyed. He packed up all that he had, everyone who was with him, and prepared to leave. During this move, Abraham spent intentional time in God's presence. Abraham began devoting himself to the God who'd called him and to guided his steps. The things he does right at the beginning are incredible acts of faith. Without knowing others in the lands they were going to, without knowing what exactly was going to happen, they went. When God made promises concerning the future, Abraham believed in them and pushed forward. This is how he found himself in foreign lands, a sojourner, an outsider. But then something happens that tests that faith that he had started to put in God. Even in his belief, while trying to hold on to the promises he'd been given, Abraham stumbles soon after he began his mission. He makes mistakes, some of them a few times over. These are moments Abraham loses sight of God's providing hand and the faith that he'd begun to cultivate for that future. He chose to rely on himself rather than God. Even still, he's considered a father of faith as he persisted when he made mistakes. Today, we're focusing on some of Abraham's failures as he began to follow God's plans. As we look at his account, we're going to talk about how doubt can lead to disaster. Then we'll look at the way deception is dangerous. And finally, we'll see amidst all of the chaos and the mistakes that were made, there's mercy in the mess. We'll start with how Abraham's doubt led to disaster. In the narrative we were following last Sunday, Abraham and his household packed up and started moving. Our account doesn't say Abraham and his family had settled down in one place yet. They were still traveling, and here we find our company making a detour. Genesis 12:10 says, "Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land." The first thing we can see here in this verse is our narrator isn't saying God had called Abraham to travel to Egypt. It says there was a famine, meaning providing for his family was probably getting really difficult. Doubt comes in here, as the only reason they were traveling to Egypt was because they weren't sure God would provide for them. Rather than waiting to see for themselves, they took matters into their own hands. Then when they get to Egypt, we see yet another display of doubt from Abraham. Genesis 12:11 through 13 says, "When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, 'I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they'll say, "This is his wife." Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say, "You are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake." Even if this isn't a full lie because of their lineage, they were admitting very important truths here. Abraham asked for this because he wasn't sure God would protect him. He was most likely trying to protect the promise God made, but trouble came with trying to do the right things the wrong way. We don't need to be trying to do the wrong things to be doing the wrong things. Abraham didn't trust God was going to protect him and provide for those future promises without assistance. So with this mindset, he chose to rely on himself rather than God. We see the same thing repeated in Genesis chapter 20 as Abraham and Sarah deceive King Abimelech. Regardless of the reason why, even after God established a covenant with Abraham, he and his wife found themselves facing a dilemma. They wouldn't let go of what they felt was their own security for the future. Even though they had stretched out one hand in acceptance of God's plans, they didn't offer both hands. We can't expect to see the promises and the plans that God has set out for us fulfilled if we don't fully surrender. It's like dealing with someone in the passenger seat who is bound and determined to steer from their side of the car. If you've ever dealt with a backseat driver, you have an idea of where this is going. These people don't necessarily mean any harm, and in fact, they're usually trying to help. We can have good intentions and still fail when doubt takes over, especially if we're looking at the road ahead and it's pretty scary. In moments of doubt, we might be that backseat driver as God guides our path. Imagine glancing out the window and seeing a storm brewing as you're driving along. You look at what's ahead, then you look back over at God, and you're kind of like, do you see that stuff up there? I mean, surely this isn't the way you're actually trying to take us, right? You maybe just aren't seeing these other options we have over here that we could try instead. I think this one looks a little bit safer, so I'll just steer us this way. We might be saying with our actions, Jesus, take the wheel, but let me hold this side of it, just in case. To grow our faith for the future, we have to be ready to let go of that wheel with both of our hands and sit tight, even if we see a storm coming. We can be sure God sees us through it. But faith means giving up on our own ways and focusing on his ways. This brings us to our second point. Abraham's example of wavering faith emphasizes the dangers of deception. In both cases of Abraham and Sarah's deception we're discussing today, other people were involved. In the first case, we find a Pharaoh caught up in their lie. Genesis 12:15-19 says, "And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, Sarah, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram, and he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, 'What is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go.' Their actions that stemmed from uncertainty in God's reliability affected not only Pharaoh, but his entire household. That lie, which might have sounded small and pretty innocent, was destroying someone's home and the lives of the people around them. Moments of faltering faith can cause others to stumble. Genesis 20:1-3 emphasizes this idea with the second recorded deception. It says, "He sojourned in Gerar, and Abraham said of Sarah his wife, 'She is my sister.' And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, 'Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife.'" The consequences for this king would have been dire. They could have cost his life while Abraham was worried about his own. His lack of faith negatively impacted the health and the well-being of someone else. We learn as we keep going in this passage, the king was spared as God intervened, but that doesn't change Abraham and Sarah's role. They were at fault here, and they caused someone else to get tangled up in the mess they were making as they floundered in uncertainty. As I was reading through these passages, the image that popped up into my head was a spider web. Not like a pretty little one you might find on someone's Instagram story with an inspirational quote, but more of the big, ugly, very scary webs you want to set on fire. Spiders weaving a web in their own territory is fine. When they start setting up shop across sidewalks or in doorways, there is trouble. Someone is inevitably going to walk through those webs, and then both the poor victim and the spider are stuck in a situation nobody wants to be in. It's an all-around mess. One of my best friends came to visit me here in Japan, and during that time, we would venture out in the evenings. On one of those occasions, as we were walking along a sidewalk, she stepped right through a spider web. But she didn't just step through it. That thing stuck to her as she continued to walk. And as she continued to go, I saw the spider trailing along on the web after her. I'm not going to go into the details of how we reacted to that, but I think your imagination will properly fill in the details I'm not telling you. You can suffice it to say neither of us or the spider were very happy with how things went down. That spider's actions affected my friend, and they caused a chain reaction. Abraham and Sarah's choice to skirt around the truth to save themselves was much the same. It's just a part of how they survived. But regardless of what it was, they were still sinning through omission. That sin had made a home in their lives as they traveled. It was a part of their routine. Yes, what these rulers were doing was also wrong, as they were taking a woman by force. But Sarah and Abraham still aren't in the clear. They were in self-reliance mode, an effort to preserve themselves, and that caused them to veer into very dangerous territory. Strengthening our faith for the future God has to offer means learning to trust in God's methods rather than our own. We'll still stumble and we'll falter, like these two did. But we can take heart and have hope. Our last point reminds us that there is mercy in their mess. There is a theme of unfaithfulness in the way that Abraham and Sarah had been responding to crises. They were trying to provide solutions themselves, and in doing so, they messed things up for others. However, an even more important theme can also be found in both of these accounts. Something was happening in both situations, even when they looked hopeless. God himself was stepping into the picture as well as the situation. In those moments when it seemed like promises were unlikely to ever be fulfilled. In that despair and uncertainty, God reminded Abraham and Sarah just who they were dealing with. They weren't dealing with a mortal ruler of lands. They were dealing with the creator of those lands, as well as the ruler of the universe himself. God moved through the miraculous and ensured Abraham and Sarah were directed back towards his plans. These stories aren't just cautionary tales about our own slip-ups. They're a reminder that first and foremost, God provides when he promises. God had made promises to Abraham, and he intended to keep them. Even when we are unfaithful, God is faithful. Can you take a moment and thank him for that this morning? When we are caught up in the what ifs and what do we do's, God still has control. He is able to guide us back to the path that he's been laying out for us if we allow him to. That's what he does here with Abraham and Sarah. God was looking toward the future, even in those moments of doubt and uncertainty when Abraham and Sarah weren't. God didn't strike them down for their insecurity or even for their disobedience. He gave them grace, undeserved favor and mercy, as he made those accounts opportunities to learn more about who he is and what he does. Hebrews 4:16 says, "Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." Part of growing in our faith for the future is knowing God will see us through our failures. He gives us grace and an opportunity to turn things around. But for that to happen, we need to let him nudge us back in the right direction. We need to be open to the changes and the corrections that are meant to help us grow. Doubt can lead to disaster, and deception is dangerous. As you're growing faith for the future, are you letting go of the wheel with both hands? Are you ready to look to whatever might come and know God has you regardless of anything you see out there right now? Strengthening that faith means learning to trust in God's methods rather than our own. Are you letting him do things his way? Or can you relate to Abraham and Sarah here? Do you find yourself trying to cut in and assist? If you could this week, try to take time and be intentional about allowing God to work things out in his ways and in his timing. Raise your hands and ask God for peace as you follow where he leads. Last, we saw amidst all of the mistakes that were made, there is mercy in the mess. Growing in our faith for the future means knowing that God's going to see us through. While the promise of nations isn't quite what we have today, we have an even more incredible assurance available to us. God offers the promise of eternity, of perfect love, and adoption into his family to all who believe and follow him. This is something we can look forward to as Christians. For those of you who haven't chosen to be part of that promise yet, remember, God is patiently waiting for your decision. He loves you, and he wants you to be part of the blessings and the plans he has, even if you come in your mess. If you'd like to learn more about following Jesus or have any questions or even prayer requests, please reach out and send us a message. We would love to connect with you, and we would love to join you in prayer and encouragement. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for these words. I pray that they would continue with us in our hearts throughout this week, that you would give us opportunities to put them into action. I pray that we would remember that we can rely on you, that even in our doubt, we can let go of the wheel. Give us the strength, the courage to let go and to look at the storms that might be ahead of us and say, it is well. God has this, and God has me. I pray that we would remember that you are working things together, and that even in our failures, in our messes, God, you're there. You'll pick us up and dust us off. Let us never look up from our failures and think God doesn't want us anymore. Let him work through when we mess up and make us better for it. We thank you for that grace and the mercy and the love that we don't deserve, but that you offer. I pray that you would give us opportunities this week to share your love and goodness and your grace with those who don't know you yet. Thank you for this opportunity to be part of your plans. We love you and we praise you. Amen.